Hi everyone, my name is Connor O'Day, and this is again the start to my new YouTube channel. So this whole channel is one that I use to teach my statistics courses, my psychology courses. I make student recipes that students send me on this channel, but now I'm extending it out to DIY all day with Dr. O'Day. So I'm going to start making some backpacking gear. From time to time, I'm going to do some woodworking projects and things like that. But to kick this off, for those of you that have been following along, I did a backpacking ultralight quilt raffle for charity. And the winner of this raffle, which was drawn on the 31st of March, was Kristen Wilcox. So again, congratulations to Kristen. But I just want to, give a big thank you, a big shout out to everyone who donated to this raffle. So the way that it worked was every raffle ticket was $5 a piece, and then we raised together as a whole, we raised almost $1,200 for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. So this is something that I like to support myself, and I thought, what better way to kick off my YouTube channel than seeing how much money we could raise for the kids. And so I'm going to be donating that money minus the cost of this ultralight quilt that's going to be going out to Kristen Wilcox. And now that Kristen and I have had some time to talk about different options for this quilt, I wanted to share with you how I designed the quilt with Kristen. Because I think a lot of time when people are first getting into kind of DIY backpacking gear, it's very overwhelming. You don't know what fabric to use. You don't know which side of the fabric goes in versus out on the fabric. You don't know what fill power means, or how to choose the fill power of down. Should you get Amazon down, or should you order some more premium type of stuff? What length and width do you go to? How much fabric do you need for all the different lengths and widths that you could have for a quilt? And so what I intend this to be is today I'm going to talk about how Kristen and I designed Kristen's quilt, and then also over time you're going to see the build of this quilt. Now, if for those of you that haven't been following the Hammock Forums Facebook page or the backpacking pages, Kristen did suffer an injury on her latest backpacking adventure. So lucky for me, because I am very, very, very busy right now. Lucky for me, Kristen is both in a hurry to see this quilt and see the finished product, but at the same time is cutting me a little slack because I am going to take a little bit to get this to her. That's just the reality of my schedule right now. I'm teaching 3 classes at Union College. So with that, I want to welcome you. I hope that you will like and subscribe to support my channel and follow along to see all of the future builds. But for today, I'm excited to share with you how we plan this quilt, what fabrics we're using, and you can see me actually place the order in this video and see exactly what I'm purchasing to make this quilt. So I'm going to see if I can use Excel here to kind of get you thinking about what exactly is going to happen with this quilt. So when we think about a backpacking quilt, we're thinking about a couple dimensions. We've got the length and we've got the width. Now, Kristen is a pretty typical, body type that we would expect. A regular length, regular width is going to fit pretty well with Kristen. So what we're thinking is typically what I recommend to almost everyone is let's use the width of the fabric. So when fabric comes to us, so when fabric comes, about 58 inches wide is typically about what you can get this for, and it's going to sell in yards. So typically for a quilt we're going to need 3 yards of fabric for the inner shell, and 3 yards for the outer shell. And so with 58 inches wide, that means that we're going to end up with a finished width of about 55 inches, and I'll explain why we end up with a finished width of about 55 inches. Now, in terms of the length, so different people make their quilts differently. So some quilts might have kind of a boxy bottom. If we're looking at it from the bottom going up to the top of the quilt, it might be a boxy bottom at the bottom there. Some people might make a rounded bottom. What I prefer to do is I just put a seam at the bottom of my quilts. And I'll show you as we build the quilt, you'll be able to see exactly what this looks like. But what that means is that because I'm making, I'm just sewing it straight across the bottom, what that means is that, if we're thinking about someone laying in this quilt, so if we think about the quilt from this perspective, where, maybe I say that this is going to be the length of the person here, what's really happening here is at the foot end, this has to then wrap around their feet. So I'm going to kind of fill all of this in. So I'm going to fill this in, and right here, I'm going to kind of draw the person that's laying in this quilt. So the green is kind of the person that's laying in the quilt, and this is their feet here, and their head is going to be up here. So their head and feet. And so what's happening here is the seam that I'm going to put, I'm going to go ahead and kind of add in where I expect that this seam would go. So now we have the seam between, and so what we've got is a foot box here. We've got the seam, and then you can see that the quilt has to kind of go up and over the feet and up and, or kind of down and under the feet as well. And so because of that, we're actually losing a little bit of width. So a size 12 shoe person, you're losing about 6 inches here, 6 inches here, and then you're losing about 6 inches, kind of on the bottom as well, but that's kind of accounted for as well. So we need to plan an extra 6 inches into the quilt by doing it the way that I do it. Again, this is my preferred. It's easier to make the quilt for one, so it's going to be easier for all of you DIYers out there. But additionally, I think that it looks just fine and it is very functional, keeps your feet nice and toasty. Some people might be like, well, if you have a seam there, isn't that going to kind of prevent your feet from being toasty? No, not at all. I have not found that that's been the case. And instead, my feet have been, quite warm in quilts. And by the way, I've had a lot of people tell me that these quilts are very warm, exactly down to the temperature rating that I suggest for these quilts. So you're going to have a nice warm temperature rating. I've actually heard from a lot of people, a couple people have said that my quilt saved their lives because it got much colder than they expected and the quilt still performed well. So, these are going to keep you nice and toasty down to the temperature ratings that I suggest. So, given that, we're losing about 6 inches in length, I typically suggest for the majority of people who are making a quilt this way to go with about a 78-inch length. About a 78-inch length is kind of what we're thinking here on the length and width. So it's going to be about a 78 by 55 quilt. Now, when we kind of think about this and we're thinking about the fabric that we're going to purchase, though, we need to take a few more things into account. So I'm going to draw this out kind of over here. I'm going to redraw kind of that. I'm just going to kind of copy this over. So I'm going to copy that over to right here. Now we also need to think about how much fabric we're losing to things like, when you make a quilt, one of the issues is you're going to have, some loss just due to seam allowance. And so, if we've got 55 inches by 78 inches, we're going to lose about an inch on all sides due to seam allowance. And so already the fabric is going to need to be 55 plus 2 inches on the width, so 57 inches on the width, and then we're going to also lose 2 inches on the length. So now 78 turns into 80 inches on the length. So now we've got, a starting point for kind of the dimensions of the fabric that we need to cut to. However, there's also a couple more pieces that we need to take into account when figuring out this puzzle. Now, this is the recommended loft height that I endorse. I fully endorse this. Again, it is not just survival ratings, but this is where you will be comfortable. So with a down quilt, so what you're looking for is if you want a 40-degree quilt, then you want the loft height to be at least 1.5 inches in loft. If you're looking for a 30-degree quilt, you want it 2 inches in loft, 20 degrees, 2.5, 10, so on and so forth. Now, the quilt that I threw in with this build was a 30-degree quilt, and I said that whoever won could upgrade it to a lower temperature rating if they'd like, and Kristen decided to upgrade this to a 20-degree quilt. So Kristen paid a little bit extra. In fact, so Kristen upgraded the fabric to a really neat pattern fabric that costed a little bit extra, and then Kristen upgraded this to a 20-degree quilt that cost a little bit extra. In fact, those two upgrades cost Kristen about $60 extra, but I want to give Kristen another shout out. Kristen didn't stop at sending me $60 to cover that. Kristen actually donated $100 and then told me to send the rest of the money to the kids at St. Jude. So not only did Kristen win this quilt, Kristen, had it in her heart to even donate a little bit of extra money. So I really feel like this quilt did go to the right person here. And again, thank you to everyone who donated to this. So with Kristen's quilt, we're looking for a 2.5-inch loft. And so now we need to think about, okay, well, just like how the loft has to get up and around feet, or I mean, like the quilt has to get up and around feet. Well, the fabric also on every side has to get up and over the loft. So in order for this to loft, it has to actually go up a little bit, and then it has to go over. And so when we're thinking about this, we're going to have to actually add 2.5 onto this in order to kind of figure out the length here. So we're going to end up with 59.5 and 82.5 is what we're going to end up with. Now, I said the fabric typically comes around 58 to 59 inches in width, so we probably won't quite achieve a 55-inch wide quilt. That's the reality and the limitations of our fabric, but it's actually going to come very close. And you'll see this when it's all said and done. It's going to be somewhere between 54 inches and 55 inches. And then on the length, we're looking at 82.5 is what we're going to need to cut the fabric to. I typically round up to 84 on a quilt just to make sure that there's a little bit extra. No one's going to complain if the quilt's an inch longer than they expected. And so what I suggest is go with the entire width of the fabric. I actually leave the selvage on because what happens is you end up, you do a roll seam. So you're going to actually roll the seam twice, and so that the selvage gets rolled in and it's just fine. There's no structural issues with doing that, and that maximizes the width as well here. So I'm going to go ahead and bump this up. So what we're looking for is fabric that's 59.5 inches wide, or as close as we can get to that, and 84 inches long. Now the next thing that we need to figure out is how much down do we need. And this is a huge question. I get this question all the time. Everyone's confused on what exactly down is. What is the down temperature rating? I mean, I see people asking all the time, is a quilt with 900 fill power down warmer than a quilt with 800 fill power down? And the answer is no. It's just that it takes less down to get the same amount of warmth, the higher the fill power. So an 800 fill power down means that 1 ounce of 800 fill power down can fill 800 cubic inches. So I'm going to say that again. 1 ounce of 800 fill power down can fill 800 cubic inches. 1 ounce of 900 fill power down can fill 900 cubic inches. So what happens is with higher fill powers, you actually need less down to fill the same quilt. So now you might be asking, well, what's the massive formula and how do we calculate out how much down that we need? Well, I said we're calculating according to the cubic inches of the quilt. And right now what we have designed up is a 55-inch quilt by 78-inch quilt by 2.5 inches in height. And so our width is 55 inches. Our length is 78 inches. And our height is 2.5 inches. So now you might be saying, okay, what do I do with those numbers and how do I calculate the amount of 850 fill power down that I need? So with the fill power that we're using in this particular quilt build is 850 fill power down. So to calculate this out, what we do is we take 55 times 78 times 2.5. And that's going to give us quite a large number, so 10,725. Well, we don't need 10,725 ounces of down. That would be incredibly expensive. What we need to do now is we need to divide this number by the fill power. Because remember, 1 ounce of down can fill 850 cubic inches. And this is how many cubic inches are in the quilt. So I'm going to take 10,725 and I'm going to divide that by 850. And this is going to tell me how many ounces of down I need to fill that quilt. So in order for a standard fill of a quilt that is 55 inches wide by 78 inches long, we need 12.6176 ounces of down. Now, I always suggest to everyone that they go with a 20% overstuff. So a lot of people say, what is overstuff? Basically, down degrades over time. Sometimes down shifts a little bit in the quilt, and what happens here is you get some cold spots. But typically with about a 15 to 20% overstuff. So a lot of people say, what about a 5% overstuff? Is that going to help? Well, not really. I'd probably just wouldn't even pay for the overstuff at that point. But 15% overstuff, somewhere between 15 and 20%, that's your ideal range. That's going to make that quilt very, very toasty. It's not adding to the warmth. A lot of people get this confused. A lot of people say, how much warmth would it add if I cut my quilt open and threw 3 extra ounces of down in there? No, 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 no. It's not going to add to the warmth. What it's going to do is make for a more consistent loft. But what's happening here is the way that you plan your quilt, you plan a particular loft. And your quilt cannot loft above that maximum loft when you plan it. Because what's going to happen here is we're going to, and you're going to see this in the later videos, we're actually going to sew a baffle in between the pieces of fabric. It's actually going to create chambers inside of the quilt. And what happens is they're going to max out at whatever you specified. So they're going to max out around 2.5 inches. And so a lot of people say, is adding extra down to my quilt going to make it warmer? And the answer is no, because you've already hit the maximum height that that quilt can loft to. You would need to get wider baffles in order to loft to a greater loft. But what the overstuff does is it eliminates drafts. It makes for a more consistent fill power. And so even though it doesn't add warmth, it doesn't add to the temperature rating, it might make you feel warmer because of that. And so to calculate this overstuff, what we do is we just take this 12.6176 and we multiply that by 1.20. So 1, because we're going to stay with that number that we calculated, and then we're going to add 20% to it. So we're going to need about 15 ounces of down, and that's nice because down is sold in 3-ounce increments. So here I'm going to round down because I said again, somewhere between a 15 to 20% overstuff is ideal, and so we're going to round down to 15 ounces of down is what we need for this quilt. And now we've designed our quilt. So we know that we need fabric that's 59.5 by 84. And we know that we need down in the range of about 15 ounces of down. Now, some people do ask me the question, well, should I get more than 20% overstuff? Couldn't I stuff even more in there and prevent draft? I mean, you could, but at that point, you're seeing very diminishing returns. Down is $35 for 3 ounces in most places, and so any more than about this amount, and you're not doing yourself any favors.